Hi everyone, I'm Fiona. I actually just finished my PhD last week, so I'm going to be presenting. So I'm going to present the first chapter that I did on that, because otherwise we'd be here like all day. So I looked at the impact of ash dieback for the functional and genetic connectivity of forest invertebrates. So I thought I'd start just by asking what I mean by connectivity and why do we actually care about it. So when I'm referring to connectivity, I'm thinking about the movement of individuals between fragments of habitat. So we have small isolated patches of woodlands or grassland, and these populations that live within these habitats are vulnerable to things like local extinctions, genetic inbreeding. So it's kind of well known that if we can promote movement between different fragments of habitat, we can sort of maintain gene flow and help to sort of increase population resilience. So because of that, a lot of these different conservation strategies want to and cite a need to create wildlife corridors to extend native woodlands and help connect patches of semi-natural habitat and to maintain well-connected systems of protected areas. And when we're thinking about our forests, trees outside woodlands are regarded as a keystone feature for helping to maintain that connectivity between our habitats. So in this picture, this is one of my field sites down in the southeast of England. On the right, we have an ancient oak woodland, which is a triple SI, and it's seen as a really important site for some insect biodiversity. And we can see that it's completely surrounded by this sort of flat, intensive agricultural land. And features like this nice tree here are seen as areas that individuals can use to move between and move across this agricultural land. And in the UK, especially in sort of areas in the south of England, ash is very common outside of woodlands. But unfortunately, as I'm sure most or probably all of you are aware, our ash trees are threatened by ash dieback. So ash dieback is a fungal disease. It's causing widespread losses of ash trees. And because of this, it's often in mainstream media. So this is just a sort of screenshot from BBC News, just to show the sort of well-known threat of ash dieback. Our ash trees are also potentially going to be further threatened by the emerald ash borer, which hasn't reached us yet, but hopefully wouldn't, but it's probably going to cause the loss of a lot of trees. So it's well known that our ash trees are threatened. And back in 2012, when ash dieback was first recorded in the UK, researchers sort of realised that we didn't know what species use ash trees. And if we don't know what species use ash trees, we don't know what the impacts are going to be. So they set about trying to create lists of species that use ash, and as we'd expect, many of these are invertebrates. And these range from species that will use ash sometimes to ones that are obligate or highly associated. For example, Praise Vaccinaria there, which is the ash bud moth, which is a species that I studied in one of my other chapters. Its life cycle is completely tied in with the ash tree. It mines leaves in the autumn, it overwinters inside the bud. So this is a species that will be severely directly impacted by ash dieback. But unfortunately, we don't really know a lot about what the indirect impacts of ash dieback for connectivity are. And unfortunately for me, during my PhD, I had to deal with the fact that these impacts are likely to be very complex. So firstly, we'd expect that different species will react very differently. So you can imagine a species that's very good at dispersing will rely less on features outside of woodlands to move between, whereas a species that's not very good at moving between woodlands will really rely on these stepping stone features. We also expect the response to depend on the landscape. So in areas where woodlands are very, very spread apart, these small patches of trees outside of woodlands are particularly important, and we're likely to see delays before genetic impacts are even observed. And all of this makes it very difficult to answer any sort of question regarding connectivity. So to do this, I used an individual-based modelling approach. So individual-based models are they're models that allow you to simulate the movement of individuals across the landscape. So by modelling individual movement across the landscape, we can start to understand how species movement will be impacted by changes to that landscape. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a minute. But my overall aims were to understand what the impacts of fine-scale tree loss are on the genetic and functional connectivity of our different ash obligate species, to try and look at how species that have different dispersal traits are going to respond, and finally how that might change in different landscapes. So what did I actually do? Well, I had these study sites. I put that in inverted brackets because unfortunately I didn't actually get to go there. These are just study sites that I did from the comfort of my own home. But I extracted this data from the National Canopy Maps and the NFI. So the National Canopy Maps give you this really fine resolution data. They actually have the location of individual trees. So they're on a 5-metre resolution. So in these maps, although you probably can't see the detail, we have woodland patches, but we also have the location of individual trees across our landscape. So we have this really fine scale data across these areas. And that data is available for England and Wales, but unfortunately, for some reason, not for Scotland. So, and I've now created this super simplified version of my map where a green blob is a tree, a dotted line is a road, and the white area will be our agricultural, urban, non-tree land. So we have our map, we have our trees, and the first thing we need to do is to create a map of ash trees. Because unfortunately, that data that is very good and very fine resolution, it's not species specific. We don't know the location of individual ash trees in the landscape. So instead, we assigned 13% of broadleaf trees in our landscape to become an ash tree. And 13% was based on data from the countryside survey, that estimated that's the percentage of ash trees in my study site area. So we have our map of ash trees now. These are the orange blobs. And we can start to think about how we want to model ash dieback. So we did this in a fairly simplified way. Every ash tree in the landscape had a percentage chance of becoming an infected tree, which are now black blobs. And when we infect a tree, it becomes a dead tree. So it's effectively standing deadwood. When ash dieback occurs, trees experience defoliation. So we took the assumption that when we have an infected tree, that would no longer provide food for invertebrates. And the other thing that was really important to me for modelling is we wanted to take into account some of the management that's associated with ash dieback. So the kind of guidance is if a tree is infected with ash dieback, we shouldn't fell it, we should leave it because there's a hope that we'll have some resistance. But if that infected tree is near a roadside or a railway, it might be a threat to health and safety. So these trees are felled. And as you can imagine, if you've got a main road, it's very expensive to bring all the machinery along and fell just one infected tree. So they'll often fell those trees that surround it. So to try and kind of represent this in a modelling way, I selected a random infected ash tree on the landscape, and then I would fell trees that were within 10 metres of that infected tree. And this time we're actually removing those trees. So we remove quite a lot of our roadside ash in some of our treatments. So now we have our different study landscapes, and we've modelled both ash dieback and the preemptive felling of roadside ash. So using that data, we create these two maps. We create a habitat layer, so that's similar to the map I showed before, where you have your maps where each cell in the landscape is either a tree or a non-tree. And in that we have our infected ash trees as well. And we also have what I refer to as a patch layer. So this is a map of our woodlands in the landscape, with smaller stepping stone patches as well. So we've made all of our landscape data, we've modelled tree loss, and now we can start to think about our study species. So we've had quite a lot about working with moths, and they were kind of the species I had in mind, but I had to use virtual invertebrates. So we create a set of virtual invertebrates which have different demographic and dispersal traits, and we also can put some genetics in there. So I'm not going to go into loads of detail about the genetics, but we can assign different genomes basically to our individuals in our model so that we can look at gene flow, we can look at relatedness between different patches. And we take all of that information and we build it into a modelling platform called RangeShifter. And RangeShifter is an individual-based modelling platform that allows us to simulate species movement. So an individual is living in a woodland, it leaves, it enters a cell. Every time it enters a cell in a landscape, it experiences a cost. So if it goes through a non-tree cell, so this is like maybe an open field, it experiences a high cost, there's a high chance of mortality. If it then enters a tree cell, it experiences a much lower cost. So by modelling its movement through each cell in the landscape with these different costs, we can start to build a picture of how individuals are moving between patches, how that's affecting population dynamics, and how their movement might then be affected when we start to remove trees in our landscape and increase the number of non-tree cells. And we run this movement models, and then we extract information about population dynamics and landscape genetics. And we made these predictions after 50 years of running our models. So we deleted our trees, we ran our ash dieback experiment, and then we predicted 50 years into the future. So as you can imagine, you get quite a lot of data with models like these. So I just wanted to sort of pull out a few key trends from the models. So the first one's looking at impacts to functional connectivity. So this graph shows the proportion of isolated woodlands. So an isolated woodland is a woodland in our landscape that doesn't receive any emigrants in a given year. So there's no new individuals entering that woodland. It might have a population in it, but nothing's entering it. And we have tree mortalities, that's our ash dieback treatment. And as we'd expect, as our tree mortality increases, we see an increase in the proportion of isolated woodlands. But what I found particularly interesting is that this relationship is non-linear. So when we have very small amounts of tree loss, from say 0 to 20%, we're only seeing a very small increase in isolated woodlands. But if you look at that equivalent jump from 60 to 80%, we're seeing a much larger increase in the proportion of isolated woodlands, which suggests, unfortunately, the higher predictions of ash loss are nearer the 60 to 80% mark. That's how many ash trees we're expecting to lose. So it suggests that we are going to see quite disproportionate impacts on our invertebrates in their ability to move between between woodlands. And then we looked at our preemptive felling. So if you remember, that's when we remove and fell roadside trees. We see a smaller impact, but we are still seeing that these features are useful for individuals to move between. At the 80% preemptive felling level, we have more isolated woodlands in our landscape. But it's the tree mortality that was really causing the big influences. I also wanted to highlight one of the species traits that we modelled. So you'll maybe have to bear with me while I explain what habitat mortality actually means. So habitat mortality is one of the dispersal traits of our species. So an individual, when it has low habitat mortality, it experiences a low cost when it moves through non-tree cells. When it has a high habitat mortality, it's highly likely to die during dispersal. So it's not as good a disperser. So basically the blue species is a poor disperser and the sort of browny orange species is a good disperser. And again, as we'd expect, those individuals that are better at dispersing, the brown ones are reaching more of the woodlands as less isolated woodlands. So we'd expect that these species that are better at dispersing will be less impacted. And what was also important to understand was how that might relate to genetic connectivity. So the previous results were looking at one generational movements, how individuals can move between two woodlands in one generation. But with many invertebrates, it might take them several generations to move across the landscape. And if we're wanting to maintain gene flow, we need to start thinking about how the genetic connectivity might be influenced. And the FST is just a metric for genetic connectivity. So when that value is low, that means two woodlands are genetically very similar to each other. So there's a lot of gene flow. When that value increases up towards 0.5, the two populations are becoming more different from each other. So there's less gene flow, they're more genetically distinct. So as we increase FST, we're decreasing gene flow. So as we'd expect from the increased tree mortality, we see a decrease in gene flow, so an increase in the FST. And we're seeing a similar sort of relationship to what we saw in terms of the functional connectivity. And we're also seeing a similar amount of effect of preemptive felling. I've pulled out a different species trait for illustrating genetic connectivity. This time I'm showing carrying capacity. So a carrying capacity is what density the species lives at, how many individuals a single ash tree will support. So an individual that lives at a high density in the landscape, that means one ash tree can support lots of individuals. A species that lives at low density, so our sort of valley orange species, that's a species where one ash tree supports fewer individuals. And as we can see, the species that live at lower carrying capacity have lower levels of gene flow. So they're going to be a bit more vulnerable to that loss of trees outside of woodlands. So we've kind of shown with these results that tree loss leads to a decline in successful dispersers and an increase in isolated patches and reductions in gene flow. What I found particularly interesting with these results is the non-linear relationship. So it suggests that we could potentially be able to identify a sort of critical threshold at what points we're likely to see these severe impacts of tree loss, which is influenced by both the carrying capacity and the ability of an individual to move through the matrix. And two results I haven't had time to go into, but are worth mentioning, is that our genetic connectivity varies a lot between our different landscapes and was really strongly influenced by the specific location of ash trees. So if you remember when I assigned ash trees across our landscape, that really influenced those estimates, which suggests when we start to think about mitigation and hopefully resistant ash might become commercially available and we can start to think about replacing ash. And if we can do that, we can use these approaches to think about not just the number of ash trees we want to put, but where we actually want to put them. So tree loss outside woodlands reduces dispersal, and this has consequences for connectivity. The impact is going to depend on the species and how that interacts with its landscape. But what I really hope I've illustrated is that individual-based models can be a really useful tool for informing management. Often these approaches they're used a lot in academic research, but they're very rarely, if ever, applied in management. And I feel very strongly that these sorts of approaches, which I've used throughout my PhD, can really help us to inform where to plant trees in order to best help species move across the landscape. Yeah, thank you everyone.